Good afternoon. This is Celia Lacayo with LA Social Science. I am a professor here at UCLA in the Chicano Central American Studies Department, as well as the African American Studies Department, and the Associate Director of Community Engagement for the Social Science Department. Today we have a great treat. We have continuing our book series here in 2022 with Sherene Razack, who has written this and published this really critical, important book entitled Nothing Has to Make Sense: Upholding White Supremacy Through Anti-Muslim Racism. And she is a distinguished professor in the Gender Studies Department with the Penney Endowed Chair. Hi, Sherene, how are you today?
Hi, I'm fine, and thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Let's get underway. So tell us, what is the main argument and contributions of this book?
So the book begins with an understanding of what anti-Muslim racism is. You'll notice that I don't use the more popular term Islamophobia. And this is simply to make the point that the issue here is not religion per se, but rather race. And that as a racism, anti-Muslim racism must be considered in terms of a project of rule and in terms of the hierarchies of the human that it installs. So we must really ask what anti-Muslim racism does. And what I argue in this book is that it upholds white property interests. So the first step in the argument is that in the West, anti-Muslim racism is in aid of white supremacy. It's a global white supremacy. It's very complicated to think of anti-Muslim racism in places outside of Europe and the Americas. And I try to gesture to this in the book's conclusion, where I briefly discuss India and China, where Muslims are targeted in the name of a supremacy that is still racial in the sense of their being constructed as sub-persons, but it's an economic and political supremacy that is secured through religion in the case of Hindu nationalism, or through ethnicity in the case of Han Chinese supremacy. So the second important point is that it's really helpful to think about anti-Muslim racism along a continuum. You have the extremist far-right version, which is succinctly captured by the popular t-shirt "Fuck Islam," and Allah is not God. And then you have the liberal version. I am not anti-Islam, Islam is anti-me. And this t-shirt really announces that Muslims are indeed terrible enough to be hated and disciplined, but it's all for a good reason. And the reason is that Muslims are deemed misogynists who deny women's rights. So what you really have then is anti-Muslim political actors who range from those expressing a very open white nationalism to others who are maintaining that Muslims threaten Western liberal values of democracy, secularism, and gender equality. And those people, they're sort of liberal racists, and they draw on a language of women's rights and human rights. And what is absolutely critical in all of this is that both forms of racism serve as a very powerful call to whiteness and sustain an infrastructure in which war making and occupations and so on can all proceed on the basis of an anti-Muslim racism. So both forms of racism, the extremist and the liberal version, uphold white supremacy, since both depend on and sustain the idea that Europeans are a superior race.
Thank you so much for making those distinctions. I think that that is where many of your contributions lie, and you're also making these global comparisons. Can you tell us specifically, as you name it, the meaning of Christian white supremacy and its importance as it relates to anti-Muslim racism here in the United States?
Well, to begin with, we have to understand that anti-Muslim racism is a material project, as I said, but it is powered by a structure of feeling, a shared kind of emotional investment in whiteness, as the t-shirt shows. And my emphasis on this structure of feeling, and thus on emotions and affect, is the real contribution of the book. And what I show is that anti-Muslim racism enables whites to feel a civilizational superiority. And in feeling that way, they experience a very warm sense of belonging and entitlement. So, let's unpack this in terms of whiteness and Christianity. Christianity gives content to whiteness. Christianity played a very prominent role in how white identity emerges in the United States. As Edward Bloom, a scholar of Du Bois, suggests, the role of religion in race making sometimes goes unnoticed because religion is often understood to be superstructural and not, in fact, how subjects come to understand themselves as white. And that's what is terrifically important here. Creating, defining, and defending whiteness, for example, played a significant role in biblical debates over slavery, but whites sought divine sanction for slavery, relying on the Bible to promote white power. So white people acted on their colonial impulses as Christians, imagining that their superiority mandated the occupation of indigenous lands and the domination of racialized others and the slave trade. So the conjoining of white entitlement to the land with Christianity gives whiteness its very Christian hue.
Absolutely. And you had already mentioned these t-shirts and this popular culture, which is again really critical. One of the many things you're capturing in the book is this contemporary understanding of anti-Muslim racism. So can you tell us more about how popular culture and how anti-Muslim racism has changed over time?
So Muslims remain entrenched in popular culture, as in these T-shirts or in films, but also in law, as a culturally backward, uncivilized people of a religion that is antithetical to Christian and Western traditions. So the role that they play, generally, they're cast as historical enemies. They're imagined as murderous avengers who are invading and polluting white Christian nations. But over time, the details of these political imaginaries shift. So you might begin perhaps with the Muslim of the military expeditions and wars of the Middle Ages, and the Crusades, or the Muslim of the barbarous, who are the barbarous occupiers of the Holy Land. But then that folds in a different time, and they fold into the refugees at the border of Europe, which is currently happening right now in Europe. We have to close the border because it's letting in too many Muslim terrorists. It also folds into the figure of, the bearded Muslim man, the patriarch who's controlling women. And ultimately it folds into, this is Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And in all of these various figures over time, it's as though time is collapsing and folding on itself. Muslims become figures in a global politics, proclaiming the civilizational superiority of Europeans and of white Christendom. So the Muslim in this is an imaginary figure of the political unconscious who installs the European as modern and who haunts the white imagination as Europe's atavistic other. But we have to remember that if the European self emerges psychically through the Muslim other, this is an act of imperial strategy. This is not just about representation. Anti-Muslim racism, like all racisms, develops not from any kind of primordial antipathy between Europeans and Muslims, the famous clash of civilization, but instead from racial projects of territorial expansion and capitalist accumulation. And all of these various racial projects are linked in an international system of racial governance. It is possible to identify an anti-Muslim racism that knits together white and non-white nations into a global white supremacy.
Thank you, Sherene. So in closing, I want to ask, These are very important contributions that your research is making in terms of race, to the race and ethnicity literature, where we don't see as much literature on anti-Muslim, and it's such a relevant topic today. So can you tell us how this pertains to contemporary times and why this is a critical book for everyone to read, and certainly for professors to assign to their students?
This book, Nothing Has to Make Sense, discusses several legal sites in the West over the past few decades. These are places where you see dread, phobia, hysteria, and desire reigning free, and you see that a global whiteness is made through the figure of the Muslim. So that is what the book does. And many of these legal battles that I discuss are extremely contemporary, such as Muslim men detained in Guantanamo and other places, such as the torture of Muslims, such as the banning of Islam in the school curriculum. So it's all extremely ongoing and relevant. So if I were to say, why should you read this book? You should read this book to understand white supremacy and its operation on a global scale. And of course, you should read this book to know how white supremacy really operates through our senses, our feelings, our emotions, so that we come to believe that the teaching of critical race theory must be prohibited, or voting rights must be curtailed, or any of these kinds of racial projects must happen. This book will help you to understand how it is we come to be in such a terrible place. How did we get here? And finally, you should teach this book, if you're a professor, to train students to analyze the terrible racial violence of our time. You should teach the book also to show how racism can structure things that appear progressive, such as protecting women's human rights. Law is a really important place to study these kinds of things. It's not the only place, but it's an important place, because it's the place where racial violence comes to be authorized. And that's one of the reasons you should read this book and teach it.
Thank you so much, Sherene. And again, please always rely on LA Social Science for your most cutting edge research and publications, as you've seen today with Sherene and her amazing book, Nothing Has to Make Sense, Upholding White Supremacy Through Anti-Muslim Racism. We will catch you next time. Thank you.